Everybody, welcome to your first PowerPoint lecture. My name is Dr. Karen Gunsner and I'll be your instructor this quarter. So I know my last name is a little difficult to pronounce, so I'm good with Dr. Karen, Dr. G, whichever is easiest for you guys. I've included my office location, and I know you guys have not yet had a tour of the college or been on ground, but I left my office information here because I'm really hoping that maybe within 4 weeks or so that we'll be back on ground and I have a chance maybe to meet each other. Here I've included my contact information so you can access me directly through email or through Canvas. Below that is David Webb. He will be your lab instructor, and his information is dwebb@beckfield.edu, and I anticipate that you'll receive an email from him maybe later this week. So I'd like to take a minute to just talk about A&P 1 and 2. This quarter is Bio 151, which is A&P 1. And then in the summer quarter, you'll take the second portion, which is A&P 2 or Bio 152. You must first understand normal anatomy before you can look at abnormal. So that's what we're going to spend the next 2 quarters doing. We're going to look at the basic structures and body systems, and this is going to provide you a foundation for all your subsequent classes, particularly your clinical classes, some of your med-surg and nursing classes. As you all know, anatomy and physiology has its own precise language. I know a lot of you are already enrolled in a medical terminology class, so you might find some overlapping there. But practicing the vocabulary, the descriptive terminology, using these terms is going to be helpful with all of your future classes, and it definitely will make anatomy easier for you. Just a few tips on how to maybe study for anatomy or prepare for your classes. I know moving to an online format has made things just a little bit more complicated, but there are still some things that you can do at home to prepare yourself. You can schedule regular blocks of time during your day that you can devote to just studying for anatomy and physiology. It's probably more effective to do multiple short sessions. Try to minimize your distractions, and I know that's going to be hard right now. We're all working from home, we're doing school from home, maybe we have children that are at home, so this might be a little bit more difficult, so make them just small, short chunks of time. Organize your material, get your things together, make sure you have your PowerPoints, quiz yourself. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to have study groups, but maybe through the online chat you might find somebody that you know, or from another, maybe from your medical terminology class, and maybe you can do scheduled talks on the phone where you go over things with a partner. So as you go through the PowerPoint presentation, you'll see the little audio icons, so make sure you're clicking on those, and I added some information or maybe clarified a few things. I also want you to pay careful attention to things that are in bold or things that are in red. These are usually definitions or key concepts that I want to make sure that you understand. So for instance, on this slide here, it's very important from the get-go that you understand the difference between anatomy and physiology, because this is our course. So anatomy, we're studying the structures and the organization of the body, whereas physiology really is looking at the functions of the body and the body parts. So here's a little bit of medical terminology right off the bat. So we have some important terms, so we want to look at pathology. So if we break that word down into its parts, we have patho meaning disease, and then ology meaning study, and we end up with the study of disease. Cyto means cell, ology is the study of, and now we have the study of cells. Histo means tissue, ology is the study of, and now we have histology, which is the study of tissue. Over the next couple of slides, you're going to take a look at some of the levels of organization in the human body. So if we look at this slide here, we're going to start at number 1 on the top left here. This is the chemical level, which is molecules. If we progress over to number 2, we're now at the cellular level, and cells are comprised of these molecules. The cell is the basic unit of biological life. As we progress down to number 3 here, we see tissue. So we take similar cells from number 2, and we're going to start to create tissue. If we take similar tissue types and put them together, we're going to start to form an organ. We put that organ within a system, and now we have an organ system. And then we take all of our individual organ systems and we create the number 6 here, which is the organismal level, or the entire human body. So as you go through the next slides, they're going to be the organ system level. So you're going to go through each individual organ system. And what I want you to do is just read about each of these here, and they're broken down by system, and then you can see the organs that are within them and then a brief function. So for example, in the integumentary system, the first one we see here, our organs are going to be our hair, skin, nails, and associated glands, so sweat glands and oil glands. And if you think about your skin, for example, the functions, it protects underlying tissue, it helps regulate body temperature through the dissipation of heat, so we sweat in the summer when we're hot. So when you go through these, just read through each individual one, pay attention to some of the organs that you would expect to find within here, and a brief overall function. So let's take a look at directional terms. By definition, a directional term describes the relative position of a body part in relationship to another body part. But before we can even begin to talk about directional terms, we have to talk about what we call the anatomical position, which is a common reference point for us to begin. So in this position, the body is upright, our arms are at our sides, so our upper limbs are at the sides, and the palms of your hands are facing forward. So if you stand up right now and go in that position, you're standing upright, your palms are forward, which means that your thumbs are sticking out at the sides. So that's going to become important as we look at other terms. Okay, so as we go through these terms, I want you to keep in mind that we tend to pair them together so that they occur in what we call opposite pairs. So if there's a front of you, there must be a back of you. If there's a top of you, there must be a bottom. So that's what we mean by opposite meaning. So I want to take a minute just to talk about some of these paired terms. So let's assume that we're in anatomical position. And the first one is anterior and posterior. In that position, the anterior aspect is anything that is on the front of your body. So for instance, your eyes, your belly button is an anterior structure, your kneecaps, so your patella is an anterior structure. Posterior is the opposite. That is anything that is on the back of you, the back side of you. Medial and lateral, for this I want you to imagine a line drawn down the front of you, dividing you into two equal parts, so directly down the front of you. Anything closer to that imaginary line is going to be a medial structure, and anything as it moves away will be a lateral structure. So for example, your eyes are medial, they're closer to that line than your ears, so your ears are more lateral or to the outsides of you. Proximal and distal refer to the extremities. Proximal means anything closer to the point of attachment. So for your arms, it will be your shoulders are the most proximal. And then when we look at your lower extremity or your legs, your hip is the most proximal. So how we use these would be, for example, in the upper extremity. If I asked you where your fingers were relative to your elbow, you would say that your fingers are more distal, or they are farther away from the point of attachment than your elbow. Lastly is superior and inferior. Superior means above or on top, and inferior means below. So for example, if I asked about your head relative to your belly button, your head is above your belly button, so it is a superior structure, and your belly button then would be inferior. Here are just a couple of terms that can be used interchangeably. So when we talk about ventral, ventral is the belly side of something, so think about your belly button, so anything on the front of you. So we can use ventral and anterior interchangeably. So if I say the ventral or the anterior surface, they mean the same thing. In terms of posterior, that is anything that is on the back side of you. You can also use the word dorsal. So dorsal means anything that is on the back side. Superior, we said, meant above or anything that is towards the head. So we can use the word cephalad. Cephalo means head. So as we move towards the head, it is a more superior structure. So let's take a minute to talk about body regions. The body is divided into what we call two portions, the first one being the axial portion. So axial refers to your head, your neck, and the trunk of your body. And the term appendicular refers to your appendages, which are your arms and your legs. So the appendicular portion of the body is really just the limbs, the arms and the legs. As you go through this slide, I just want to highlight some of the important parts here. If you look at the left-hand side, for instance, the buccal refers to the cheek. That's a little less common term that you'll hear. Axillary is the armpit. I do want you to look at the arm. The upper arm is the brachial region. The bend of your elbow, where you bend at your arm, is called the cubital. You can also use the term antecubital. Your forearm then is the antebrachial. Your wrists are carpals, and your palms is the palmar region, or you can use the term metacarpal. And then we have our fingers, which are digits or phalanges. Your kneecap is patellar. Your ankles are tarsal bones. Your toes, again, can be digits or phalanges. On the backside structures, so on the dorsal part, we have the scapula, which is your shoulder blades. We have the gluteal region, which is the buttocks. We have lumbar, which is the low back. We have popliteal, which is the area behind the knee. And then we have plantar surface, which is the bottom of your foot. In Connect, you'll see an area called the Practice Atlas. I've left the icon here so that you can find it. It is an e-text. In here, there is a table of contents that allows you to select body orientation. And within here, you'll be able to practice doing directional terms, naming some of the anterior and posterior structures. So I'll try to include this maybe in your lab this week, so as you go through this in lab that you can use this. This is a good resource for you guys. Our next topic are body planes and sections. When we describe a plane is really an imaginary two-dimensional flat surface that marks the direction of a cut through a structure. So you want to imagine that we're going to make cuts through the body as we go through here. So a cut along that plane will create what we call a section. And we look at these are important for several things. If you've ever had an MRI or you've ever looked at CT scans, what we're doing is making these sectional cuts through the body and trying to see how we would look at our organs from that perspective. So let's take a look at some of the body planes and sections. The first one is a transverse or horizontal plane. In this cut, what you're going to do here is divide the body. So you're going to do an imaginary line, and you'll divide the body into a top and a bottom. So you'll have a superior and an inferior portion. The second one is a sagittal plane. A sagittal plane would take that imaginary line down the body, dividing it into a right and left piece. If we had a median plane or a mid-sagittal cut, that would mean that we divided us directly down the center, creating an equal right and left sides. In a frontal, also known as coronal plane, this is like if you wear a headband. If you cut the headband, you're going to cut down the body and end up with a front and a back, so you'll end up with an anterior and a posterior portion of the body. Body cavities. Let's take a look at some of the cavities that are within the body. So we divide us, first of all, into a dorsal and a ventral cavity. So we have dorsal structures and we'll have ventral structures. So let's start in the dorsal cavity. In the dorsal cavity, there are going to be two subsets. We're going to have a cranial cavity, which will house the brain, and the vertebral canal or vertebral cavity, which is going to house the spinal cord. So in the dorsal cavity, there are only two structures located within there, and that is a brain and the spinal cord. If we move to the ventral aspect of the body, we're going to have the thoracic cavity, which is the chest, which houses the lungs, the great vessels, and the heart. It is going to be separated from the abdominal pelvic cavity in the front by the diaphragm. And then if we go down to the abdominal pelvic, it really is the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. In these areas, abdominal, you're going to find most of the organs of the GI system. And the pelvic cavity will house some of the reproductive and the bladder. Let's take a minute just to look at the body cavities and some of the subdivisions. So if we start on the left-hand side of your screen, we can see the two dorsal structures. We see the cranial cavity, and then we see the vertebral canal where the spinal cord sits. And then if we move forward from that, in the purple color, we'll see the pleural cavity, which is within the thoracic cavity. This is where your lungs will sit. The pinkish red color is the pericardial cavity, which is housing the heart. Then the arrow is pointing to the diaphragm, which will separate the thoracic from the light blue color below, which is the abdominal pelvic. Moving over to the right-hand side, again, we can see the purple color representing where the lungs will sit in the pleural cavity. We see the pericardial cavity in the center there. That center portion where the heart sits has another name. We call that the mediastinum. Then we see the red diaphragm again, and directly below that is the abdominal and the pelvic cavities. Let's talk about membranes. Membranes support and protect the internal organs within these cavities. So we're going to have a couple of different membranes that we're going to look at. First of all, in red here you see the meninges. The meninges is a membrane that protects the brain and the spinal cord. Next down we see what we call serous membrane or serosal. These are going to be membranes that line the body cavities and the organ surfaces. So we're using the balloon picture below to depict the structure of a serous membrane. So we're going to see that it is actually a double two-layer membrane. So it's like pushing your hand into the balloon. You'll see a double layer over that. When we talk about the term visceral layer, the visceral layer is going to cover the organ itself. So it's going to be directly on the organ itself. The term parietal layer is going to be the membrane layer that is going to line the cavity walls. Here's an example of a serous membrane in the thoracic cavity. In the thoracic cavity, we are going to house the lungs. So you'll see the lungs there depicted in pink, surrounded by the bluish color membrane. When we're talking about the lungs themselves, we're going to use the term pleural or pleura. So if we talk about parietal pleura will be the layer that lines the thoracic cavity. So you'll see it's the outermost darker blue color. Visceral pleura is going to be the layer that adheres directly to the lung cavity. So if you look at the lung and you go just outside the lung, you'll see the little bit darker red on top of the pink. That represents visceral, so that's directly on the lung surface. In between those two layers, the pale color, the white color in between there, is representing what we call the pleural cavity, meaning the space between the two layers. And in that space, we're going to put pleural fluid. This fluid is going to help bathe the area, reduce friction, and allow things to glide more easily. So let's take a minute to talk about homeostasis. This is an important concept that we're going to see throughout A&P 1 and 2. So let's first define it. Homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively stable internal environment by self-regulating physiological processes. It is a dynamic process, so it is a dynamic equilibrium, meaning that it changes, so it doesn't stay the same all the time. And then in the last bullet point, disruption in homeostasis. So if we fall out of that normal, stable internal environment, that leads us to disorders or diseases. So let's take an example of temperature. So that's very common right now with the COVID-19. So our temperature, we think about our temperature as being about, let's say, 98.6 for the average person, maybe 98.4. So our body is constantly trying to maintain that stable, nice temperature. As we see the temperature go up, we start to fall out of homeostasis, and for temperature, what it indicates to us is a possible infection, whether it be bacterial or viral. So we know that that disruption leads to that. So our body is always trying to bring that temperature and keep that temperature at a normal level. So how do we maintain homeostasis? We're going to do it through what we call feedback mechanisms. So let's take a look at this one, a negative feedback mechanism, or it's often called a negative feedback loop. This is by far the most common regulatory mechanism that we have within the body. And if you look at the bullet in red here, it says it stops automatically once a set point is reached. So we're going to have a stimulus that happens within the body, and then when we reach a set point, we're going to need to turn that off. So example, body temperature or blood pressure. But let's use the example of your house. So let's say you want to turn the air conditioning on and you want your house to be 74 degrees. So when it is hot outside, your air conditioning will kick on and it will run until you reach that set point of 74 degrees. And then what we need to do at that point is we turn the air conditioning off and we stay at that set point until it goes out of homeostasis. Your house becomes 80 degrees, your air conditioning kicks back on. We run through the mechanism or the loop until you bring your temperature back down, and then we shut it off. And that is a classic, what we call negative feedback loop. So let's take a look at a negative feedback mechanism within the body. What we're looking at here is the regulation of glucose, which is your blood sugar. So if we look at the bottom arrow there, we'll see the red arrow where we begin. So as we go up, our stimulus is that our blood glucose rises. So let's say you just ate that large La Rosa's pizza. What we're going to do then is go to a receptor, which is the pancreas. We're going to hit the pancreas, and we're going to then send information over to the pancreas and say we need to release insulin. We're going to start to release insulin from the pancreas. The insulin is going to go after that blood glucose that is high, and it's going to lower your blood glucose back down to a normal level, which returns us to homeostasis. But now, once our blood glucose is back to a normal level, we need to turn that stimulus off so that we stay at that set point. Let's take a look at a positive feedback mechanism. It uses the same components as the negative feedback mechanism did, but here we're going to amplify or continue our stimulus. So once we start a stimulus, we want it to be continued on. We don't want to turn it off. This is used for rare events rather than the daily maintenance of homeostasis, and the examples within the human body will be blood clotting and labor contractions. So bravo everybody, give yourself a hand. You've just completed 1 week of lecture material. So now some reminders. Make sure you complete your Connect homework assignments. You have until the following Wednesday at 11:55 to complete those. There are some practice questions loaded in Canvas, so you'll see a tab there for practice questions. It is in a Word format. So these are some practice questions, maybe quiz-like questions or exam questions. And then make sure, most importantly, that you post for your attendance today. So you'll go back into Canvas and you'll go under the Module 1, Week 1, and you'll see an attendance tab. And it's going to ask you to talk about, in a group discussion format, the anatomical position and the importance of that. So if you have any questions at all, please make sure you reach out to me, and congratulations, and I will talk to you later in the week. Thank you.